Okay, welcome everyone to the Fort Ord Reuse Authority special meeting for Thursday, October 26, 2017. Let's have the Pledge of Allegiance to be led by Ms. Reimer, please. Thank you. Mr. Hulamar, do you have announcements?
Yes, the first would be that we have a new board member today representing the city of Seaside for the first time at the Fort Ord Reuse Authority Board, Jason Campbell. The second item, much more mundane, but for many of you here, an important one. This particular Saturday is National Public Lands Day, and I believe almost everyone in this room has received an invitation to participate at 9 a.m. here with our folks at the Bureau of Land Management in our Fort Ord version of National Public Lands Day. And third, this Saturday is also an important day for all of you golf fans who know that the Veterans Cemetery is supported by the Heroes Open Benefit Golf Tournament that'll be at the Black Horse Bayonet Course on this Saturday. Chair, those are my announcements.
The Brooklyn Dodgers, yeah. Okay, so at this time we'll have roll call, please.
Supervisor Parker. Here. Supervisor Phillips. Supervisor Adams. Here. Mayor Edelin. Here. Councilmember O'Connell. Here. Councilmember Morton. Here. Vice Mayor Hoffa. Here. Mayor Rubio.
Here.
Councilmember Campbell. Here. Mayor Carbone. Here. Mayor Gunter.
Here.
Councilmember Garfield.
Here.
Councilmember Reimers. Here. Kathleen Lee. Nicole Hollingsworth. Here. Erica Parker. Here. Debbie Hale. Dr. Diffenbaugh. Steve Monterazzo. Dr. Ochoa or Andre Lewis. Here. Colonel Brown. Bill Collins. Here. Dr. Tribely. Lisa Reinheimer. Dr. Moore, you have a quorum.
Thank you. The first and only item of business is item number 5A, the Transition Planning Workshop. Mr. Hulamar, would you like to introduce the item?
We'll make sure we have all of our technical support here working. Try that again. We'll just share. So Chair Rubio and members of the board, I want to open this workshop by thanking all of the board members who have taken extra time to forward questions our way. We've received special written ones from not less than 4 board members. We received phone calls with additional questions from board members. At the last meeting, we received a lot of comments from members of the public. We also received comments from members of the public over the last week asking for us to respond. I also want to thank especially members of the Transition Task Force who probably will look at me with disdain about the hundreds of hours of their time over the last couple of years that they may never get back. But we do want to thank them for the extra efforts that they put forward in bringing together the information that we at staff have done our best to try to compile and respond to questions that we've received. I also want to note we've received a number of letters that have also gone to board members over the last couple of weeks. We know that our colleagues at Landwatch have also sent us several questions. We've done what we can do in a sort of work in progress way to respond to those as much as we can in real time, put them on the web, and we are constantly improving those as we get additional input from members of the board. So there's quite a bit of work. I know every board member has spent every moment for the last week and a half reviewing all of those items, and you're completely up to speed. Today's workshop is also to follow up on those 2 years of work, and in some ways, steps in crafting a framework for this board to be able to comply with the state requirements for a transition plan that would be provided to the Local Area Formation Commission by the end of next year. In fact, today we have a 5-part agenda for our workshop, and we did this in workshop format at the board's direction from the last meeting, so we could conduct a workshop that offered an opportunity for the presentation to be heard by the board members and the public, then the board members to be able to exchange thoughts and ideas about the items, and then have public input at the end. So today we intend to produce a PowerPoint staff PowerPoint that does our best of interpreting the very heady work of the Transition Task Force in putting together a series of recommendations. Some of them simply have to do with what the goals of the transition ought to be. Some have to do with structural or format. Some have to do with the powers and what do we need to make sure that we have resources to continue the work going forward. So we're hoping at the end of all that, either today or as soon as possible, that additional information can be provided to staff so that we can refine those in a way that produces the transition plan that we're required to produce under state law. So those are the main things that we're going to try to do today. So I wanted to kick off our staff presentation with just a note about last meeting. I provided some rather directed comments. I appreciate the 7 board members that called me afterwards, thanking me for giving some responsive comments about what was the thinking and when FORA was created, why that makes a difference to you in that regard, how the transition is going to affect folks in this region. But mostly my comments had to do with about assumptions that were made a couple of decades ago that proved out to be different than what anybody thought at the time. And that we have an opportunity now to kind of make sure that those things that, and I think I repeated maybe 4 or 5 times, that you don't know what you don't know. There really are a long list of those kinds of items about you don't know what you don't know. You didn't know some things about the buildings, you didn't know about munitions and explosives, you didn't know the extent of habitat conservation, you didn't know the requirements that CEQA was going to make this organization produce in terms of roads and stormwater and fire protection and so forth. But now that they're known, and they're somewhat quantifiable, because looking into the future, we still have munitions and explosives reports, we still have things that need to be finished. The Army is now 26 years into the munitions and explosives work on Fort Ord, and that last I heard, we still have another decade or more to go before that's complete. So there's quite a bit of work in that regard that we still are finishing. In fact, I noted that in a relatively short time frame, we knew that the 5, 10, 15, and 20-year projections that were bandied about quite a bit by all of the leadership in the 1990s was really 50% of what it was going to take to do the recovery program. In fact, just a few years ago, this board applauded the fact that the very best economists that we asked to give us advice told us it really should have been a 40-year plan, and that we are still another 12 years away from being able to be at roughly 80%. So today, staff is asking the board to take a long look into the next steps to review the detail that was seen by the Transition Task Force and provide, to the best our ability, provide as much information as we can for the board to be able to do its job in completing the transition plan. However, we're not proposing that you approve a transition plan today. In fact, as I said, the transition plan is before you until next year. What we're really asking is that you not make any final decisions that about a transition plan, but give staff and the community some direction so that we can provide you full information and answer questions that can sort of discern and define the differences between moving forward in a single entity, multiple entities, some sort of cross between the two, and what makes sense for this region in making a regional decision. So I do want to say that there's a bunch of questions that have been in front of us that we're not sure we have a full and complete ability to answer. And the reason why I say that word ability is I'm not sure anyone has the ability to answer some of these questions, not in our lifetimes. Things like If there was no future development, do we still have to protect the habitat? An interesting question. In our opinion, staff's opinion, we were always required to protect the habitat. It says that in all of our deeds. But if you don't complete the development and if you don't generate the revenues, how would you pay for that? It's questions that we don't know for sure. There are things like the new things that have come on board. The new initiative processes that have been used in communities right here and in other places. Could contractual obligations be overridden by the initiative process? An interesting legal question, not one we can answer in a short period of time. And there are other questions that we do have answers for, but they're all going to be the kind of testy, tough questions that this board will have to wrestle with. John Giffen is already aware of the kind of requests that we've heard. We've got requests from Marina Coast Water District. They want to make sure we have everything in our program defined correctly. Well, I want to thank them for providing a letter today to make sure that we have the record correct. We'll make that adjustment in the record to make sure it's right. But as part of the process today, we will attempt to address those previous questions by, as we go through the PowerPoint presentation, we'll try to highlight where the responses to questions we've received are, to the best of our ability, addressed. And we will also try to succinctly answer those questions. Yes, we put a bunch of answers on the website because we wanted to do it in real time and transparently. We even had to leave a couple of blanks in a few places and misspelled a couple of words because we're trying to get it out for the public to absorb in as much time as possible. So I'd like to ask Sherry Damon if she would begin the process, and I know that Sherry is sometimes a little hard-hitting and sometimes not as patient as the rest of us. Sherry has done a lot of work in understanding the background here. She's really doing this slightly outside of her task program. All of us on the FORA staff are taking on additional responsibilities here. But as risk coordinator, I asked her to look at these issues and if she could provide this PowerPoint presentation. We anticipate all of this to take less than 45 minutes so that we will have time for the board members to exchange and have communication with the staff. Thank you. I apologize again. I know late in the afternoon a PowerPoint presentation from staff is not exactly great, especially when it's as warm as it is today. And I know all of you have meetings after this. So Sherry?
Thank you, Mr. Hulamard, members of the board, members of the public. My name is Sherry Damon, and I've got some good news and some bad news for you. You just heard Mr. Hulamard say that this presentation is going to take 45 minutes. I have 30 slides, but we spent 15 to 20 hours in the TTF going through information. This is not intended to duplicate that body of work. It is some of the highlights and some of the things that I think are important for the board to start this consideration and the debate for the next steps in the transition planning process. And so I'm going to go with that. And if you don't mind, I'd like to sit down to do this presentation because 45 minutes is a long time to be standing up, 30 slides, and I want to make sure that I give a thorough briefing. Okay? Is that okay?
Will that be all right for the camera?
All right. First slide, easy transition issues. So what are we going to talk about? Oh, I need to click. Click. What are we going to talk about today? Well, this is an overview. We're going to talk about the Fort Ord Reuse Authority Act. What does state law say that this board needs to do in terms of transition planning? And we're going to talk about the transition planning history a little bit, what we've done, where we've been, the recommendation coming out of the 2017 Transition Task Force. We might be able to address some frequently asked questions, but if we don't get to that, we'll be moving on to the next steps. So with that, here is click. Got to remember, I've got two different computers going on here. This is Government Code Section 67700, and it's the B section. It talks about what a transition plan must include. It shall assign the assets and the liabilities, designate responsible successor agencies, and provide a schedule of the remaining obligations. There's also a due date in this same code section, and it's 18 months prior to the FORA expiration, or December 30th, 2018. Currently, December 30th, 2018 is the date that a final transition plan would need to be presented to the local agency formation commission for the next step in the transition process. I'm going to be talking about the task force process. I'm sorry, I'm not done with this slide yet. Thank you for reminding me to click. I'm getting help here. Maybe I do need next click. There we go. Let's talk about the transition planning history. So in 2016, the chair convened one task force whose main charge was to provide direction on post-2020 options. The task force charge for 2016 is on your desk so that you can see what the exact charge was. Out of that process, there were numerous meetings, the public attended, various people participated, and this board ultimately adopted the recommendation, which is to seek extension of the Fort Ord Reefs Authority on the one hand, but to proceed with transition planning on the other hand. I think there's some confusion. In 2017, the chair convened a different task force with slightly different charge, actually a different charge, and a slightly different composition to address the next step of the transition planning process. And that is to focus in on the transition plan. And part of that charge is also on your desk. 4 main tasks. How do we assign the obligations, liabilities? How do we prioritize infrastructure? What kind of financing mechanisms are out there? And what should a successor agency look like? That was part of the charge for the 2017 task force. Those meetings were held from April through August. Public meetings, public participation. Developers participated, city county staff participated, interested members of the public came to those meetings and provided input into those meetings. Ultimately, coming out of that process was a recommendation. And the recommendation was to form a single successor agency to complete the outstanding FORA program, whatever that is, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, to seek extension of FORA's CFD and other powers. We're going to talk about that a little bit, although I'm going to focus in on the financing portion of that, the Community Facilities District, and to allocate a fair and equitable share based on an implementation agreement formula and a voting percentage for administrative liabilities. That is the Transition Task Force recommendation, and that's what I'm going to focus in on today. And I would note that based on this board's action last month, this board unanimously adopted a legislative agenda. And a part of that legislative agenda, which was unanimously approved by this board, was to seek FORA financing, to assure there would be financing to complete FORA's obligations post termination of FORA. So there may be some places where there's unanimous concurrence in the task force recommendations. Oops. So, create a single entity successor JPA. Let's talk about that. So, one of the first things that the task force considered was the transition plan goals. What is it that we want to accomplish with a transition plan? And this list is one that there was virtually unanimous consent that these were the right goals for a transition plan. And that is to implement the base reuse plan economic recovery, implement the base reuse plan mitigation measures, implement the base reuse plan policies, and then this part, the including but not limited to affordable housing and or jobs housing balances. There was some discussion by task force members about whether or not it was appropriate to call out just this one policy as a part of the policies to be reviewed, and to collaborate and maximize and leverage regional resources, and finally, to commit to a fair and equitable distribution and contribution towards finishing the program. And in addition, FORA would continue to implement the recovery, mitigation, and building removal as much as possible prior to its sunset, and seek to minimize successor agency liabilities. The task force also considered this. So this is some of the priority infrastructure assignment coordination, and this comes directly from the Fort Ord Reuse Authority's Capital Improvement Program, which this board reviews on an annual basis and adopts. It sets forth the basic obligations that face this board post-FORA. So the majority of all obligations are contained in the Capital Improvement Program. And that's what we focused on here was one piece of it, the on-site and off-site transportation. You'll note, and on the left-hand side is what is in the Capital Improvement Program, who the lead agency is. FORA has 6 projects that it is currently responsible for. If these projects are not finished or completed, the column on the right, the assignment column, is the staff proposed assignment of these obligations to jurisdictions. This information was also presented to the task force along with the estimated dates for completion of these projects. Every project in your capital improvement program currently has a similar chart that is associated with it, whether it's a regional transportation item, a water item, a habitat conservation item. They are all listed out with target dates for completion and funding. So as these, you'll also note that this chart captures the obligation dollar amounts. That's an important point. Those will change over time as projects are, as we move forward in time, the project costs may change. Projects get retired off the list, they get completed. And so this list is subject to change. Go to that next slide. Your task force also considered what a ramp down, or as functions transfer post termination of FORA, as FORA starts to go away. This is demonstrating how a ramp down might look. Try not to focus on the direct line. It's not necessarily a direct line. This is a graphic illustration only. The key issue here is the functions that are left post 2020 as FORA completes its major obligations that are identified in the capital improvement program, and those get retired. The need for FTE is reduced. And it may be, this is our best estimate, it may be 10 to 12 based on the things that are, we think post 2020 would need to occur. Or it might be something less than that based on what's left in the program. And as we go through time, you can see that it ramps down until finally you are at an administrative and accounting, you are collecting fees, you're reviewing the capital improvement program, and you are distributing what's out there. The staffing level is substantially lower as the FORA projects are retired off the capital improvement program, as those obligations are satisfied. Transition Task Force also considered the major functions, the major obligations. What is it that FORA does? This is somewhat simplified, but it captures some of the major things that we do, the biggest portion of it. You have transportation, and there are 3 parts to that: regional, on-site, and off-site. This is the multi-agency version of the one possibility. So regional transportation obligations would transfer most likely to the Transportation Agency of Monterey County. Off-site would transfer most likely to TAMSI if it's in their existing program, or to the jurisdictions if there are programs or pieces of roadways that are not included in TAMSI's current network. And on-site projects would most likely transfer to jurisdictions. You have water, and we understand that Marina Coast has submitted a letter today about some of these possible assignments of receiving agency, and those are issues that we can prepare a more substantial response to later. But this is our first take at it. That water augmentation would most likely fall to Marina Coast Water District and or what used to be called the Pollution Control Agency, or now I think it's Monterey 1. Wastewater would go most likely to Marina Coast or Seaside Sanitation, and water service to Marina Coast Water District. Habitat conservation, another big part of what FORA is doing, would most likely go to the Habitat Cooperative, although I will put a star by that because those documents haven't been finalized yet, and there's still negotiation about how that cooperative will work and how the obligations will be funded. So there are still multiple issues with this multiple agency on the funding, maintaining some of FORA policies. The Army, Eska, most likely to the county, or a limited agency JPA to handle those obligations, but a single entity most likely. And building removal would fall most likely to the jurisdictions. Consistency determinations, most likely to the jurisdictions to make those decisions, or by agreement for somebody else to make those decisions. And finally, administration or Calpers obligations. Currently, the FORA board has set aside money to address the terminated agency unfunded liability. So when an agency terminates, Calpers does an annuity estimate of how much retirement benefits, how much is going to be due when an agency goes away, because there's not an ongoing business. And that number right now is estimated to be between $6.6 and $8.8 million pursuant to Calpers. FORA board has set aside about $7.3 million. So we are projecting that that will be a fully funded liability by 2020. So what does it look like on the single agency side of things? Well, the functions are identical. The difference here is that a joint powers agency would most likely be handling all the rest of the story, all the rest of the coordinating the implementation, collecting the funds that FORA currently collects from its CFD and other revenue sources, and distributing them out to retire the obligations that are left in the capital improvement program. And there's only two real exceptions. One is Marina Coast Water District is under contract with FORA right now, and that contract terminates when FORA terminates, and so a JPA is not FORA. So Marina Coast would then be responsible for water rights and service. And wastewater, we've got Marina Coast Water District and or Seaside Sanitation, depending on jurisdiction. There's some service coverage issues here that may come into play, and so we've indicated that here. Habitat Conservation Plan is the cooperative, but we're anticipating that the JPA might end up being a revenue collection source for that, that the habitat management pieces of habitat management, which the cooperative is uniquely positioned for, would focus on the management of the habitat and maintenance, etc. But the collection of the dollars that fund the HCP would be collected by the Joint Powers Agency. Likewise, the JPA would handle the remaining Eska obligations. We've got building removal here, although FORA's part of building removal is projected to be completed by 2020 if there is a carryover obligation, or if that changes pursuant to board policy, we would anticipate the JPA would be responsible for funding that and taking care of that. Base reuse plan consistency would be handled by the JPA. There would be a regional forum to do that. And the administrative PERS obligations, again, fully funded by 2020. So there would be some impact to the JPA, but a new agency has different PERS rules than existing agencies. So here's some of your issues to think about and consider. Will South County be weighing in on Fort Ord Road projects on the peninsula? I can't even read my own slides here. Will Seaside County, Delray Oaks, Monterey be represented on the Marina Coast Board? Water transfers over there. There are current representation issues. Would FORA's on-base first policy be followed by the successor agencies? How will voting members be assured that their reuse priorities, for example, habitat conservation, adequate roadway infrastructure, Highway 1 viewshed, affordable housing, be adequately addressed and preserved? Who will enforce base reuse plan limitations thresholds? How will consistency be determined, or consistency, who will do the consistency determinations? And how will the fair and equitable contribution distribution be maintained? We're not planning on answering these questions for you. These are considerations for the board's considerations and weighing in giving staff direction on the next step of the transition plan. So staff was asked to put together some pros and cons, and we recognize that one man's pros may be another man's cons, depending on what you want to have happen with the ultimate direction this board takes on transition planning. This is staff's best estimate about some of those pros and some of those cons. So some of the pros on a single entity JPA program: establishing a joint powers agency is within the control of the local agency. It controls the provisions of the JPA agreement. It's formed pursuant to existing state law. So there is no amendment in order to form the JPA. There's a certain amount of continuity in terms of completing the FORA program, making sure that the base reuse plan provisions and policies are followed, and that the capital improvement program is implemented. It provides a separate legal entity. There is some shield that occurs when you form a joint powers agency. So the underlying jurisdiction does not necessarily have to take all of the risks associated with the joint powers agency's work. And finally, it does a single point of contact. These are not exhaustive lists. These are just some of the ones that we were thinking about. And let me note that although I am doing this presentation, the FORA staff has jointly participated in the preparation, review, and analysis of some of these issues. So this is not the Sherry Damon version of transition planning. This is FORA staff's collective information that is being presented to you. Some of the cons of a single agency: limited regional powers. How do you go across boundaries? You have to do that by agreement. You might have some limitations on what kind of financing mechanisms you can use if you don't extend FORA's current financing, like your community facilities district. Usually you have to rely on the underlying member agencies' financing powers in order to create replacement financing structures. FORA contracts would need to be revised and or assigned to reflect a new agency name, have some startup costs, no regional track record for the JPA itself yet, and there's less home rule. If you cede your home rule to a joint powers agency, there's less unilateral ability to do what you want, but it's all by contract. So The joint powers agency concept is one that is formed by contract. We did the same thing for the multiple agency version. And some of the pros, and again, same caveat, that the one man's pros may be another man's cons, or a person's cons. Some of the pros, the function transfers to subject matter agencies. So transportation, regional transportation in particular, would be transferred to the Transportation Agency of Monterey County. That is what the Transportation Agency of Monterey County does primarily, our regional roadway networks. No additional legislation is required to make those transfers. The cities and the county control their underlying land use and development, so there's more home rule. Cities and counties control their own financing districts for their local impacts, and there's an elimination of consistency oversight, so it becomes decentralized. The implementation of the base reuse plan starts to shift and become decentralized. So that's on the con list. Infrastructure priorities, and when those projects that are listed in the capital improvement program are finally implemented. That's a potential con. Who controls that? How does it happen? How does it work? The financing rules may change. If FORA's fee structure goes away, it has to be replaced. The regional agencies have said, or at least TAMSI has said, they are bound to Nexus determinations. And we're going to talk a little bit about the taxation versus Nexus. But in a nutshell, what that does is when you shift to a Nexus version, new development, it starts to shift the burdens to job generators from housing. So it's a different formula. The tax allows FORA to implement its policies promoting economic development, whereas a Nexus structure says, if I build X, you will pay the amount that's related to your development. So it's a different, it promotes different equities or inequities based on your priorities. It decentralizes the base reuse plan capital improvement implementation. You now will have TAMSI doing transportation, Marina Coast doing water, you'll have individual cities doing their road projects and their own developments. And so where will members of the public have to go? Well, they will have to go to TAMSI to challenge a road project, to the City of Marina to challenge a City of Marina project, to Seaside to challenge Seaside's project. Some of that is happening now, but there will be no regional place where people can come and find consolidated information about projects on Fort Ord. They will be broken down. You might have non-Fort Ord entities participating in decision-making, and that goes to the board representation on the boards, for example, like Marina Coast. Will East Garrison people be represented adequately on the Marina Coast Water District Board? Will Seaside have representation on that board? How is that going to be addressed? That's a potential issue. How will prevailing wage, the base reuse plan, and capital improvement program obligations be enforced? Who does it and how does it do it? Since there's not going to be a regional collecting place or clearinghouse and it's all over the place, do you have multiple lawsuits all over the place? It's a possibility. So let's go to our next recommendation. And here I'm going to focus mainly on the Community Facilities District and why we think that not only is that where we have unanimous consensus from this board, but it makes a certain amount of sense. And it made sense to the Transition Task Force because they included it in their motion, that their recommendations that they have elevated now up for board level discussion. So the first thing that the Transition Task Force considered, and this board has seen a version of this before, is a transition summary. This table attempts to capture the bulk of FORA's obligations. What is it that we have left to do? On the left, expenses and potential assignments, and this potential assignment list was does not fully reflect the single entity, but it is what the Transition Task Force saw. On the right-hand side are the projected amounts that are outstanding for that obligation, to retire those obligations. And I would note that these numbers all come from your capital improvement program, which is reviewed on an annual basis in conjunction with the FORA financial consultants. We just finished a biennial review of our facilities district fee, which is prepared in conjunction with FORA's financial consultants. These are not unilateral staff made up numbers. We have consultants to assist us in coming to these numbers in our capital improvement program. So the outstanding obligations from the capital improvement program are $179.5 million. That is the current projection in your current capital improvement program. I will say that that's a number that's subject to change. As you retire projects, as costs go up, as litigation or lawsuits occur, the numbers are subject to change. But the obligations, the main obligations, are not. We have the Eska Requirement, which is a obligation that we currently receive Army grant funding to complete. There is an unfunded amount currently that's projected to be between $7 and $10 million. There's a star next to this, and this information has been presented both to this board last year and to the task force this past year. Currently, I think this board authorized the executive officer to seek an amendment, and we are within a couple of weeks, I believe, of finalizing that amendment and knowing for certain what monies will be available. We're hopeful that this obligation will be a fully funded obligation post-2020. That is the hope of FORA staff, and FORA staff has been aggressively pursuing that. Finally, the last liability that's listed are administrative liabilities. This is your Calpers terminated agency unfunded liability. Calpers, on an annual basis, does a annuity projection. The number, they will give you a range. A year prior to dissolution, that number will start to become more refined. The range currently is $6.6 to $8.8 million. FORA board has currently set aside $7.3 million to address this. Transition Task Force has also seen the primary sources of FORA's revenues and the best guess of whether those revenues are assignable or not assignable. So you have your community facilities district fees. Those are your developer fees. Some people might call them a developer fee. Those are unassignable in their current form. They are a Mello-Roos special tax, and that is not subject to LAFCO jurisdiction by state law, by the Mello-Roos Act, and by the LAFCO legislation. It's been exempted. We have land sales revenues. Those might be assigned with the implementation agreements to successor agencies, or they might be returned to the jurisdiction. That's an issue that Authority Council is currently reviewing, given Task Force most recent direction to follow the implementation agreement formulas. You have the property tax formula. Again, the same property tax amounts might be assigned with the implementation agreements to a successor agency, or they might be returned to the jurisdiction and redistributed. And finally, we have grant. We have an Eska grant. It may be assigned with Army consent. It's currently under negotiation. So let's talk about your main financing and why it is that you might wish to pursue extension of the Community Facilities District, the special tax that exists now that generates most of the revenue. This is how your capital improvement program is funded currently. Big chunk of it comes from tax dollars, primarily for habitat management, water, and transportation. Your land sales dollars, a big bulk of that goes to do building removal, and the extra rolls up into the capital improvement program to help lower the taxation rate for developers and retire the habitat management, water augmentation, and transportation obligations that FORA is currently pursuing. And finally, your property tax revenues, or a portion of them, deal with caretaker costs, prevailing wage, and your economic development. So there's some staff time and obligations that this board has set as a priority to address. So part of this, and a question that has come up, the issue of entitled development versus future development. Entitled development is development that's already been approved. It builds and has rights and water allocations to build, and many times has agreements in place that they will purchase land at a certain price, etc. Entitled development fees will generate, if it builds out 100%, $71 million worth of development fees, plus or minus. Some of that will be reduced. These are in 2017 dollars. So as entitled projects build, that number will go down a little bit unless another entitled project takes its place. So let's talk about which projects are entitled. Well, you'll note I've done it by jurisdiction here. Marina has the dunes. It was entitled in 2005. It has a development agreement that has 3 phases of development and about 1,400 houses, I think. You have Sea Haven, which was entitled in 2004, and you have Cypress Knolls, now, which was entitled in 2007. All 3 of those projects have undergone FORA consistency determinations, and whether or not, even though there is some dispute about whether or not Cypress Knolls will ever be built or not, the fact of the matter is that if a developer came in and was consistent with that prior approval, Marina would be in a very unique position of already having entitled that project and allowing it, if it chose to exercise its discretion to let it go forward, to do so without further review by the FORA board. RV Resort for Delray Oaks is in a similar position. They've received entitlements and consistency review in 2016. Seaside Resort is entitled. It's a much smaller number. The amount is about 125 housing units. It was entitled in 2005 in Eska. So why am I making a big deal about these numbers in the entitlement? Well, there are certain exemptions that are out there, and a very fundamental principle of land use development law, which is entitled development is not subject to brand new fees. In fact, the TAMZ regional fee has 2 exemptions which apply in Fort Ord. One is the entire Fort Ord area is exempt, and I understand they're undergoing in preparation for accepting responsibility, looking at their regional fee program to make sure that the FORA area is captured in their new studies and new work. But there's another exemption, and the exemption is if you have a project that's subject to a development agreement that was entered into prior to 2008, when the fee went into effect, the fee does not apply. So there's a real question, legal or otherwise, how you address that potential shortfall. There's going to be a shortfall. Also, the Subdivision Map Act has some exemptions from applying brand new fees, development fees, on already approved development. That's why I'm calling this out now, so that the community and this board can be aware that there are multiple projects out there, and the financial impact could be pretty substantial. If you can't apply a new fee, it's about a $71 million hit. That's it in a nutshell, and that's up to $71 million of potential lost revenues to finish and complete the FORA program. So what do future development fees look like? Well, future development is based also in our capital improvement program by projections that the cities and the county have provided on the projects that they anticipate will come forward on a certain timeline. Those fees right now are projected to raise about $51 million worth of development fees. But future development is future development. It is not an assured thing. There are lots of variables in whether or not that future development goes forward. Is the infrastructure in place? Is there an adequate water supply? Have habitat issues or CEQA issues been adequately addressed? Are there lawsuits that challenge some of these projects? So there are lots of issues about the certainty of those future fees, but let's just assume, go with me here, that these developments go forward, that we are able to, and we all want to move to finish the program, which is $179.5 million. I call this the simple math. You've got entitled development fees of about $71 million. You've got proposed development of about $51 million. That leaves a shortfall of about $57 million, plus or minus, that you have to make up from something else. We have a program that's $179.5 million. You can see the CFD for entitled projects covers basically your HCP and your water, almost 100%. If you just build that, you can address that pretty easily. Or you might even be able to address some of the transportation, some permutation of that. Your proposed development makes a big dent in the transportation pieces of this. And the rest of the story is made up with land sales revenue. Now, that's a little bit of an oversimplification, but really this is to highlight how important to this region the Community Facilities District special tax is. So let's talk about what that tax is. That tax is formed pursuant to the Mello-Roos statute. That's Government Code Section 53-311 and following. It does not require a nexus. It is for public services and public facilities. FORA has focused mainly on the public facilities, the base-wide costs, and the mitigation measures. Building removal is not currently an allowed expense under Mello-Roos unless it's in conjunction with a public facility which remains in existence for longer than 5 years. The FORA CFD will terminate upon FORA's dissolution, and that's pursuant to two provisions right now. One is pursuant to the Mello-Roos statute. It does not have a provision that allows the Mello-Roos district to be transferred to a successor. Additionally, there's some information inside our own Mello-Roos language that says it terminates when FORA terminates. But there's also some other language that suggests it could be assignable. So there are only two ways, guys, to extend the Mello-Roos special tax that FORA currently has. One, you extend the FORA Act. And when I say this, I'm not advocating for FORA to be extended. This is more of a, extend. It could be a FORA light, it could be a FORA shell, but one way to extend the CFD is to extend that legislation that provides FORA to do it. Fix the vote, fix the consistency determination, amend and extend, basically. Or you can amend the Mello-Roos to allow for transfer and continuation of your current Mello-Roos district. And staff has some very concrete examples. There are three particular Mello-Roos sections that we think would be appropriate for amendment, for those of you that are taking notes. Government Code Section 53313.5 to address the issue of building removal. That is something the TTF did not consider directly, although it's indirectly considered in other powers. But that provision or that amendment to address building removal as an allowable expense of a CFD provides benefit, whether you have FORA's existing community facilities district or a jurisdiction is developing a brand new replacement CFD to replace the 401. Then you have discretion to either include it as an allowable expense or not. Section 53368 to add a definition for authority to mean forward reuse authority and or a military base reuse authority. So there are two kinds of authorities here that might benefit from an amendment to Mello-Roos. And 53368.1 to provide specifically for transfer by an authority to either a member jurisdiction or a appropriate successor agency. that would meet the other requirements. So those are 3 suggestions. Staff would be happy to bring back a more focused bill synopsis and background white paper should the FORA board direct staff to pursue that course of action. So we did some opportunities and some risks. Well, some of the opportunities we just talked about, it could provide for building removal, some flexibility there. It could allow for assignment of FORA CFD, which maintains a certain amount of consistency. It captures the already entitled development. It's an existing fee. It captures future development if and when it happens. And finally, it does provide future background, so future-based closures. There's some financing flexibility that could be of interest to other areas besides just Fort Ord. There's some risks. Legislative process, it's a statewide, it would be a statewide amendment. And if it doesn't pass or we don't make any progress, the burden would fall to successor agencies to figure out how to do a replacement financing. So let's move to the third point. I'm on slide 26. I'm getting there. I know it's been long. I appreciate you bearing with me. Got my water and I haven't even taken a sip. Third part of the recommendation, utilize the implementation agreement percentage assignment for jurisdiction's fair and equitable contribution to the successor to complete the FORA program. So just to flesh that out a little bit more, staff's understanding of what that would be is that the real property-based obligations, those obligations in the remaining to be completed in the capital improvement program would be assigned to the Joint Powers Agency successor. The land-holding jurisdictions would contribute based on the implementation agreement formula. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. Those payments would also be assigned to the successor JPA agency to complete the program. The administrative organizational liabilities, here we're talking about Calpers, which is mostly funded, we believe. Those would be assigned to all current voting members. And that's a question we're going to pose in a few minutes about what that looks like. So fair and equitable share. This is the language in your current implementation agreements that each of the underlying land use jurisdictions has with the Fort Ord Reuse Authority that says how much you contribute to completing the base-wide costs and the base-wide mitigation measures. 50% of your land sales or lease proceeds. The tax share that FORA would generate by the Health and Safety Code, and FORA's fees or assessments, less whatever a jurisdiction performs that retires the obligation off the capital improvement program. So if there's an obligation project in the capital improvement program that, let's say, City of Marina builds a section of road that's in the current capital improvement program, their fair and equitable share would be reduced by that amount. What does that look like? The Transition Task Force considered some approximations. We were asked to provide, what is maybe some of the financial risk? What's that look like? Well, we used future build out in part because the implementation agreement formulas are based on future use, future build out. As you take down a project, you contribute your money on the basis of the implementation agreement formula. So this is a rough approximation. It's not it's supposed to be set in stone, but if you have a $179.5 million set of obligations, county has about 16% of the future build out left. Their obligation would be about $28 million. Delray Oaks has about $23 million. Marina has 66. And why is that number so high? Everybody might ask that. Well, that's because Marina still has a lot of the future build out to happen. So that number is very high. Seaside has 29% of the overall build out. That's about $52 million. And UCM Best has about $9 million. UCM Best is listed in there because it is anticipated that that portion of development would be done by private parties in the build-out of the UC Invest property, which, as we know, has not yet occurred. No. Monterey is shown at 0%, and why is that? We know City of Monterey has land that is slated for development, but that's a rounding error. Their 100 acres, it generates such a small percentage of the overall 179 million, it basically rolls to zero. It's less than 1% of the overall cost of the CFD fee. Voting percentage, I know it's on everybody's mind. How much will City of Carmel be responsible for if there is a Calpers liability under the task force recommendation? 1 vote is about 8%. 3 votes, 24%-ish. 2 votes, there's some rounding errors in there, but basically 2 times 16%. You can do the math, but that's it. And we're showing a $7 million potential liability. I would note this is a liability, it's not an obligation, meaning real cash will be required here. If it's a $7 million shortfall so it would be 14.3 instead of 7.3 that we've set aside, you would be looking at about $538,000 for 1 vote on the board, 3 times that amount if you have 3 votes, 2 times that amount if you have 2 votes on the board. But again, that number is projected to be much less than $7 million. Here, this is only for illustration purposes only. So there are some policy questions and considerations that the task force considered, and I think this board needs to consider as well. Should the land use jurisdictions and voting members be required to participate in paying for the administrative liabilities? The TTF recommended that the voting members do participate. They've participated in making some of the regional decisions that affect the area. This board may choose to do that or not do that. How are obligations built, funded, and retired? Do we continue with the implementation agreement formulas or try to change the formulas? Currently, as I said earlier, Authority Council is looking at the issue of whether or not the implementation agreement formulas are assignable. They are an asset to FORA because they do not have end dates. I expect to have something in the not too distant future about that. How is fair and equitable contribution distribution maintained if the funding mechanisms are changed and or the capital improvement program is not completed? And does the recommended funding mechanism, replacement funding mechanism, complete the capital improvement program obligations? Who prioritizes the capital improvement program obligations, and when do they get built? The Transition Task Force majority recommended that the single entity JPA structure, successor structure, would be the best position to coordinate and implement the remaining CIP obligations. And guess what? I am at slide 30. And now I am turning it back to Mr. Hulamartin for the next steps.
So in terms of next steps, we at staff were hoping that the board could first inquire, ask staff how we might best respond. We thought this presentation gave you a fairly decent overview of the work that's been done. Again, I want to reiterate that it's but a snapshot of the hours and hours and hours of work that the TTF put in, but it's also only a snapshot of the background underlying work that the FORA staff has done to be able to provide these kind of answers. And it's a reflection of the work that this board has done over 23 years in many different ways. So you're here at about 44% on some people's charts, 38% on other folks' charts, 31% on other folks' charts in terms of completing the base reuse plan, depending on if you're looking at jobs, how much housing, how much entitlement, how much of the infrastructure, depends on the measure. That's where you are. But the real question is, how do we provide you more information, or are you prepared to do something with respect to the goals of creating the single entity, the Transition Task Force recommendation in some way today? That's what we would ask for. And then once you complete that process, not assuming it's going to get completed. And once that's processed, where do we go from here? What's next meeting?
Okay, thank you for that presentation. There was a lot of information there. Questions or comments from the board? Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for this presentation. This was very helpful information and remarkably clear. My head is about ready to explode, but so this is the kind of thing that I think we were looking for in our materials leading up to this meeting. So I really appreciate you putting it together and all the work that the Transition Task Force did to kind of sort through these issues. It's easier to see what everyone was working on. So I think in your staff memo you made it really clear that one of the linchpins to completing the things that need to be done on FORA is the CFD financing, and the real advantage, or one of the advantages of it, is that it's kind of flexible. So, and one of the options that you didn't specifically cite was the ability, if we were to pursue state legislation, to be able to assign the CFD fees and powers to collect those fees. You mentioned, I think, to a successor agency, but it could be to a new CFD board, a separate entity, right?
So there are lots of options in the section dealing with the transfer of authority on a community facilities district. It could go to a smaller CFD board, which would be a separate entity. Mm-hmm. It could go to a city. You could break it down to it. I'm not suggesting this. You're asking me a general question, so I'm giving you a general answer. There are different ways you could structure it. That would take, it has to be by written agreement, though, pursuant to Mello-Roos as that's currently structured. It's a question about whether or not you'd want to make it pursuant to some kind of a, I don't know if we want to even open this door, about a LAFCO order on, LAFCO is going to make the final assignment of the assets and liabilities. Currently, LAFCO does not have power over a community facilities district tax. That's not something that's within their power structure to be able to address and transfer. It's usually cities and counties. They go to taxing entities, usually, for assignment.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Ms. Morton?
Thank you. Thank you, Sherry, for your detailed presentation. And I do have some questions, and part of my questions are for clarification because there's a lot of the public here. So just to be sure that we're talking about it. On your slide 4, you made the statement that there might be an overlap between the recommendation of the 2016 Transition Task Force and the 2017 Transition Task Force. And having sat on both task force, the first task force, the question that was posed for a vote was a yes-no vote that should FORA continue to be extended to 2035. The majority of that task force voting yes, that's what came to the board in December of 2016, correct?
Actually, it was dual track, which is what came to the board and was ultimately approved by this board, was to seek extension on the one hand and simultaneously pursue transition planning on the other hand.
Okay, I think that dual track got created at the board level, not at the Transition Task Force. So I'm just trying to clarify that the scope of the 2016 recommendation was very narrow by staff direction at that time, staff preparing the motion that came in front for the vote. So I have a problem with the overlap, and I'm trying to make that distinction so that our board members aren't thinking that the prior Transition Task Force was making some other weights or comments with regard to what happened in 2017. There wasn't an overlap. so it's a point of concern.
I-
If I can go to staff to the, the question was that the motion? And then on your slide 9, where you have the assignment, potential infrastructure assignments coordination. It's slide 8. I'm sorry, it's really hard to read.
Yeah, sorry.
So, in fact, what this is what is the estimated cost for the build-out over the entirety of however long it takes to happen, correct?
So this is the information. These are the obligations in your current capital improvement program. So to the extent that FORA's obligation is a dollar contribution toward a project, then the answer would be yes. To the extent that FORA is building the entire project, then the answer is not necessarily.
Okay, so, but these are based on a collection of the development fees or the CFD, correct?
No, these are funded in part the way your capital improvement program currently funds. So it is funded in part with a community facilities district fee, in part from your land sales and your property tax revenues, and in part from FORA grants. So many of these projects in the past CIPs have been retired through the efforts of FORA and others to obtain grants to build those projects.
Okay. In 2016-2017 budget, are we relying on grants for transportation, water augmentation, or habitat?
Reliance is the wrong word. I do think that we are seeking grants for some of the roadway projects.
Okay. But currently, those were not
They're
considered
not in the budget.
in the budget.
No.
And in fact, in the 2016-17 budget, we had 0 from land sale proceeds.
I'm hoping that turns around. Sell some property, would you?
We're trying. So
Good.
the point is that this largely is funded from CFD, and isn't it true that FORA only pays for these things as it collects the development fees or collects the CFD?
Yeah, FORA has been described to the Transition Task Force and to others as a pay-as-you-go organization, meaning we don't go out and spend money that we don't have. Or historically, that is not the normal mode that FORA uses. However, I will note that in the past, FORA has gone out to obtain loans or other revenues in order to retire certain obligations, like building removal, for example, and then figures out a different way how to retire those obligations. So currently, we have not done that.
So, for example, Marina's obligations here, we would only be required to contribute as the development happened under the current CFDs to collect that and to continue to apply the CFDs to these obligations. Marina also would not be required to go get a loan or finance it from some other way, correct?
That's how the capital improvement program is currently structured. However, in the LAFCO dissolution process, that's an issue I do think that needs to be addressed. And one which the executive officer referenced earlier, which is what happens if you don't build? What happens to the fund? What happens to the obligation? How is that funded, et cetera?
And then on your slide 9, where you have the current staffing of 16 full-time employees, which in the 16-17 mid-year budget that was approved by this board, our funding for 16 full-time employees' salaries and benefits was $2,955,000, correct?
I'm not sure about the exact number.
Okay.
But I will tell you that when we looked at this, and we presented this to the Transition Task Force, that we made a statement that by natural attrition, the salary savings shown there is about $1 million.
So looking at that, when you address, and I sit on the Finance Committee, and I know we're trying to fund the PERS liability. So what I'm also asking is that if FORA is extended in any manner, such as up on this slide, where you are either going down to 10 to 12 full-time employees, whatever the number is over time, isn't it in fact true that that PERS liability will increase over that time because of additional monetary commitments to people's retirement?
It may or it may not. It depends on a lot of variables, who the staffing people are, what the economy does or doesn't do. Calpers routinely and annually adjusts their numbers. We've all the jurisdictions that are sitting at this table have been on the receiving end of a Calpers calculation and a changing calculation. So, and it has gone down. Sometimes those liabilities go down and not up. We expect them to go up as retirement benefits continue on, but that's
So-
not always the case.
Yes. So currently, all of the jurisdictions, I think, at least through my city manager, I know that we're considering in the city of Marina that our PERS liability will continue to go up over the next 5 years. Wouldn't that be, why would this PERS liability act differently than it would for the rest of our jurisdictions?
So here's why it would be different. It could be different. FORA currently has a program that keeps up with its existing PERS liability. This liability that we've been talking about, that 7.3, is the terminated agency unfunded liability. When we consulted CalPERS on that very specific issue, we were told that the amount of difference would be incrementally very small compared to the $7.3 million. So it's not like another $7 million. We've consulted CalPERS on that. Now, CalPERS obviously is able to change the CalPERS interpretation, and it will be a calculation when the agency finally does terminate. There is a noticing process, and there's a valuation that gets assessed at that point in time.
So then in our staff report, there's an exhibit, attachment B, that talks about the CFD, or the development fees, which you're indicating in these slides terminates in 2020 unless we take some type of legislative action.
Right.
And in the Transition Task Force in 2016, we were presented with information that the CFD would continue potentially to 2051. And that statement also appears in attachment B that expresses that the transition, I'll just read the sentence. First, the language contained in the CFD states the CFD shall terminate upon FORA's termination or 2051, whichever is later.
Actually, I think that's a typographical in that report because the day is whichever is earlier. In the actual CFD language, it's whichever is.
Okay. And what code section does that appear in? Can you
That is not a code. So you might recall when I did this part of the presentation, I said there were two reasons why you couldn't assign. One is the state law, which enables Mello-Roos, says that it doesn't make provision for a FORA authority to assign the CFD. The second is the language inside our existing CFD, what we adopted, which has that language which is subject to interpretation. I have an opinion about that, but I think that issue can be addressed through a combination of legislative amendment, which allows the transfer, and an interpretation that the alternative language of FORA termination or 2051, there's no reason to have 2051 unless it was contemplated to retire the entire base-wide mitigations and base-wide costs. That's the two-prong piece of extending your CFD. One's in state law, one's an interpretation of your existing documents.
And so then going to your slide 22, one of the things that the Transition Task Force wrestled with was what you're trying to depict here, the CFD about what pre-exists So the entitled projects are already under contractual obligation that their CFD has been set at roughly 22,200. I know it can be adjusted, the number, but it's been set by a formula, how we arrive at it. So when you're talking about proposed CFD in the future, if in fact FORA sunsets, and now any jurisdictions looking at development that's not already entitled, under Mello-Roos, that jurisdiction would be able to create its own CFD, correct? And we would be able to then adjust what the numbers are, and in fact, we may be charging more for a CFD in the future from a new development, because we're adjusting the cost, our shortfall.
That's always an option, actually. That will depend, though, a little bit on the interpretation that Authority Council will render on your implementation agreements, because many, I think Marina in particular, has a second implementation or an amended implementation agreement that has a formulaic approach to how it can calculate its CFD fee. So there could be some limitations about how a jurisdiction could calculate a replacement CFD fee if those agreements remain in existence.
So it's if that contractual agreement remains versus if it does not.
That's one issue, and of course, a jurisdiction always has the ability to do a CFD. It can do it now. The implementation agreements allow for jurisdictions with board approval and consent to do replacement financing districts. So you could currently be raising money, additional funds, if you chose to do that now. So to date, individual jurisdictions have not chosen to pursue that route.
And then the last question that I have goes to where you are talking about if there's multiple agencies or a single agency, and who would determine the base reuse plan implementation and consistency going forward. And in the transition task force there, we addressed that the base reuse plan was recorded against each title of property, each title, their covenants that run with the land, correct?
That is one legal interpretation, yes.
Okay. And currently, when there's a consistency challenge, for example, I'll use Monterey Downs as an example. Monterey Downs came forward, its EIR identified that it was inconsistent with the base reuse plan as to the density of use at Parker Flats, and as to the fact that there was inadequate water. Now, that wasn't challenged here at FORA, that was challenged in the local jurisdiction in Seaside. That's where the matter was heard and the public challenged. So how would that be different in the future if there is no FORA?
Actually, correct me if I'm wrong, did the Monterey Downs project actually make it to this FORA board for a consistency determination?
No.
It did not. So FORA board never really got to weigh in on the consistency determination. That project was challenged prior to making it to this board for that determination. And it's very possible this board might have said, it's not consistent.
But it was effective, my question is, it was effectively challenged. In part, there was inadequate water. In part, that the density was wrong at the jurisdictional level without having to come here. So I'm trying to figure out what would be the change that you're trying to protect in your slide presentation.
Well, I have to tell you, if I were representing one of those developers, I might have argued they were required to come to this board before bringing that challenge. That's not what they argued. That's not my job to make their argument for them. But this board is the final determiner of consistency by state law. That's what it says in the Authority Act.
I don't have any other questions. Thank you for answering them, Sherry.
Mr. Edlin.
Yeah, the Transition Task Force met 8 times over the last year for over 18 hours under the very able leadership of Andre Lewis. They came up with some fairly simple recommendations. The first, create a single entity successor. That would be probably the 5 land use jurisdictions in CSUMB. It would be a voluntary association. Nobody would be forced to do it. If the land use jurisdiction or CSUMB felt that they could join the JP and get some advantage out of it, they would. If they otherwise, they would not. Second, seeking an extension of the CFD powers for successor. I think everybody agrees it's one of our legislative proposals going forward. We have to have CFD if we're going to implement the Habitat Conservation Plan. And finally, utilize implementation agreement percentage assignment for the jurisdiction's fair and equitable contribution for successor to complete the FORA program. That's the task force recommendation. I'd like to move the recommendation.
There's a motion and a second to move the task force recommendation as presented. Questions? Oh, you can do it under the second, that's fine. Yes.
If you go to slide 3, I believe it was referencing the government code section.
Yep.
Yes, what you quoted there, and I appreciate that very much that you did that, is government code section 67700 B2 in part. But in B1, it makes reference to the Monterey County Local Agency Formation Commission, which is LAFCO, shall provide for the orderly dissolution of the authority. Based on the wording in the existing law, doesn't this board actually have to prepare a transition plan which sets forth the sunsetting of FORA in 2020?
So, yes, it does. And unless this legislation, unless the Authority Act is extended, this board needs to submit to LAFCO 18 months prior to FORA's expiration or December 30th, 2018, a transition plan.
So aren't we, excuse my...
And I believe, and just to clarify for the public and the members of the board, the section 67700 is provided the actual full language. This is just a snippet because it's a slide, and it would be really boring if I just put the whole law up there.
Yes, and I believe there's some out front, but aren't we somewhat putting the cart before the horse if we're talking about a JPA or an extension for a light unless the law is changed? Aren't we limited to actually preparing a transition plan that says FORA has to dissolve so that LAFCO can comply with its legal requirements?
So one of the things that we discussed in the transition task force is we talked about methodology. There was a lot of time spent on methodology. How do we allocate? And it was discussed if FORA is extended, that methodology, how you do it, how you select to proceed, can be applied in 2020. If FORA goes away in 2020, you have a way to assign your obligations and your liabilities. Or if you go away at a later date, the same formula will most likely be applicable. There was one slide that I showed up here that had a column that said 2028, and that's because it's a carryover slide. When FORA did the financial projections, it was showing that by 2028, all of the obligations that are set forth in the capital improvement program, and there are lots of assumptions, and I know the jurisdictions are looking at their own financial analysis of whether or not that could be true or not, whether or not a replacement mechanism is appropriate, some of their options. But FORA's initial projections are those obligations are retired by then, and with fairly conservative land sales dollars and development projections.
As to the implementation agreements, if it were to be found that they are assignable to LAFCO, let's assume that's the process to be followed, would the land use jurisdictions such as Delray Oaks, Marina, Seaside exercise their rights through LAFCO?
No, if those agreements are determined to be assignable, I think the thought process is part of the transition plan would determine who is assigned the rights, the revenues that would be generated under those implementation agreements to retire the obligations in the capital improvement program. And that is going to depend on how this board structures how it would like to see the transition plan. Is it going to be a single agency, a JPA, in which case, if those agreements and the obligations are assignable assets, they would all get assigned to the JPA that is going to take the obligation, liability, responsibility to collect and implement the capital improvement program obligations.
Well, what if there's no JPA, though?
And if there is no JPA,
Yes.
and you select a multi-agency, then it's a different kind of a math problem about how that might look. And it might be that it's a combination. It might be that the city of Marina doesn't want to join a JPA. Let's say that that happens. But it might be that Delray Oaks and Seaside and Monterey get together and the county get together and say, yeah, but you know what, we want a JPA, in which case they would get assigned the implementation agreements obligations. So I think there are a lot of different variables out there as to who or how the implementation agreement revenues would be assigned. The extending your and allowing transfer of the community facilities district does help address some of those things, because it keeps in place a process for generating quite a few of your funds, almost 2/3 of your funds, in a fair and equitable manner. It's already, the process is set forth. It can still adjust. There's a process. There would be a process to review the priorities in the capital improvement program that are funded by the special tax. Those obligations would continue. Somebody would be designated to do that, whether that's a JPA or whether that's the county or somebody else. That would still have to occur.
But, forgive me if you've already answered this and I'm not understanding fully your answer. Let's assume that FORA sunsets June 30th of 2020. Who would the implementation agreements be assigned to if in fact they were assignable?
The implementation agreements, depending on this board's approval, my thought is the implementation agreement obligations would be assigned to the entities that are completing the capital improvement program.
Okay. Thank you.
But let me give you a caveat there. So that's not necessarily the jurisdiction. When I say assignable to who are completing, the jurisdictions you saw from that table, the one small table that I showed on slide, not sure where I am here, where it talked about this. In the transition task force, we actually compiled the assignment, how many dollars it would take the county, for example, to retire the obligations that are set forth in the capital improvement program. That number was like a 60-some-odd million dollar number. It was quite a large number. And their projected amounts that they would be generating under their implementation program is not anywhere close to that, which means that revenues that would be generated in the other jurisdictions would need to be sent to the county to complete and retire those obligations. Does that make sense? Are you understanding that part of it?
More so. Thank you.
More so? Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I appreciate the motion on the table, and I have a couple of concerns because the language that's in our board report talks about a legislative extension of the CFD. I'm really pleased to see the CFD stick around. Then it says, and other powers, which are unclear as to what they are, to the successor entity. And I'm a little concerned about this because it could be construed by our friends in the legislature that this is an extension of FORA. And I am concerned about that because in my reading, the mood and the climate in Sacramento is not conducive to an extension of anything that looks like redevelopment. So I don't know what the possibilities are there. If we want to explore this, I think that, I think it's maybe, I wouldn't do it, but, if somebody else wants to. The other challenge is that a joint powers agency, I think you said it's voluntary, and I don't know how important it is for all of the entities to participate, but if one decided they didn't want to, I mean, you could have some issues. I don't think FORA can force that to happen. I don't think the state legislature can tell people who, that they have to join. Maybe they can, I don't know. But anyway, so I think there may be some appetite to pursue the staff recommendation, but I would like to, and I don't know if I need to make a separate motion or whether it can be, one of these dual track items, because I think that a cleaner, more fruitful avenue for pursuit is exploring with our legislative friends the ability to amend the Mello-Roos or whatever law it is that would allow the assignment or transfer of the CFD to a new entity, to a new board. And I just say board because we don't even necessarily know how the staffing would happen. And that board then could determine the allocation of the CFD funds to habitat mitigation, to water stuff, or to the percentages or the allocations to roads and all that good stuff. But I think that I feel we have a better chance of success with something that's more limited like that. And so I guess I want to ask the maker and the seconder of the motion whether you would be open to having this be kind of a dual track that we can pursue, or whether I'm going to need to make a substitute motion or some additional motion.
I do believe that this board will present a transition plan to the state legislature in LAPCO. That's without question. I think that this language here is expansive enough where what you're asking for can be accomplished under this this motion. I know the executive officer has heard what you've said. I've heard what you said. Everybody's heard what you said, and I think we agree in concept that that's a good track to take. We're taking a broad view, and as we move along here at the board level over the next several months, we will be refining those points and getting putting it in a pencil sharpener and getting it really tight. And I think that before we talk to Senator Monning, we'll have a very clear, concise bit of language that we want to present to him and the legislature.
Mr. Chair, I don't want to jump over anyone here. Just two questions. The first is, to what are you referring? Are you referring to the 2017 Transition Task Force Committee charge?
I'm referring to the board report in today's agenda.
Okay, so I see what you're doing. I would like to make a substitute motion. And I'll tell you what my motion is. My motion is to hire an outside consultant that is like a retired judge to help us through this process. And I say this, I hope I can get a second on this. I say this because I feel like this is one of the most important decisions that we're ever going to make. Just as we talked about at the meeting on October 13th, when Michael laid out all of the importance of everything that has gone before us and that's been done, I don't feel that I have enough information to move forward. I think Sherry did a terrific job of laying out so many things. I think that's just great, but for virtually every slide, there could be another interpretation. And as much as I have worked with you, Ralph, and respect your thought, I am not comfortable just with the promise that we're going to pursue a legislative track as well. I just feel that we would all benefit from having more information from an outside person who would take a look at all of the good work that's been done now and give us some of the secondary thoughts that we can have the opportunity to take a look at and digest. At this point, I feel that as I said, for every slide, it's almost like you can look at it one way or you could look at it another way. And as I just feel that we would do well to just pause, take the information, hire an outside consultant, and have that person take a look at all of the information and then come back to us and let us know, if you do this, here are the outcomes that could happen. And you could choose A, B, or C. If you do this, here are the outcomes that will happen. You can do D, E, and F. I just think, from my personal perspective, I do not feel comfortable with the information that we have received to be able to make such an important vote.
Okay, so Director Adams, would you make a motion?
So my motion is that we hire an outside consultant to come in, review all of the information that we have to date, and then guide us through the transition process. So is there a second to that?
Okay, there's a motion and a second.
Thank you. I have a concern about that, and I think it's a laudable goal to get clarity. But let's look at time frame. To hire a consultant who can get up to speed to facilitate this, unless there are people with this existing expertise, and I don't think so, we're looking at 6 to 9 months before we'd have any, even an opportunity to do a coalescing of opinion, particularly if our outreach to a consultant or facilitator remains as broadly open as this currently is. I think that might be a viable solution to help us get through some rough points, but I think we really need to lop off some possibilities before we get to that point. An example would be to say that going forward, this group absolutely wants to make sure that the CFD is retained for the benefit of projects. And that's a given. You want that. But that we will not go forward with an extension of FORA as is. So those are some limitations, some scope that I think we can take a crack at, and then as needed when we hit the facilitated part, then somebody has a realm to work in. And that comes from my background as a facilitator. I wouldn't take this on if you paid me $1 million.
Jerry?
The staff recommendation is as broad as it can possibly be. We're looking at a JP. It doesn't get any broader than that. Whatever form it takes will be sausage making made by this board. We're very good at sausage making, okay? And nothing's going to happen until a vote is taken by this board. So it's going to be transparent. My main consideration after being on this board for a long time is that this board is very unique in that we have land use jurisdictions and we have non-land use jurisdictions. And some of the most valuable members we have on this board and the hardest working are the non-land use jurisdictions. Some of the best ideas we have, the fact it's a regional area, it gives everybody in this area a stake and a voice in what's going to happen here. If we don't do anything here between now and 2020, theoretically, and FORA goes away, and there's nothing after that, there's nothing. Just back up 1 second. We had a problem with water here about 7 years ago. In the perception of the Monterey Peninsula mayors, the Water Management District was not doing anything. So what did the mayors do? They got together, they formed a Joint Powers Authority, a JPA, and the rest is history. A JPA can be formed very, very quickly. If we do nothing by the end of FORA, the 5 land use jurisdictions and CHMB can theoretically get together and form a JPA with absolutely no input, no influence, nothing from any of the outside agencies or the non-land use jurisdictions. If we do this within house, everybody has a voice. Everybody has a chance to shape what's going to go on in the future. If we don't continue on and we allow this organization to die, what you see is what you're going to get, and it's going to be done by the 5 land use jurisdiction and CHMB by themselves with no input. So I'd rather see a cooperative arrangement where we work together, come up with the best solution for the region, and move on.
Mr. Chair.
Okay, let's hear from Ms. Reimer. She'd been sitting over there patiently, then Mr. Hopper, and then Ms. Barton.
I agree with the concept of the greater group working together, and the fact that joint powers can be by choice is worrisome to me. I know that the properties were gifted to the jurisdictions, and I recognize that those were came challenges with those gifted properties, very definitely. But at the same time came an obligation. And I want to be sure that we recognize the obligation that the whole represents, that we're a community beyond our boundaries. And I would just like to speak to that and hope that the joint power agreement, if we do go forward with that choice, is, if I'm understanding, can be by choice. That is a worry to me, and I'm just hoping that all the jurisdictions will understand that their property came to them with challenges and it came with obligations.
So I would like to make an alternative motion that we,
Substitute.
a substitute motion. Okay, thank you.
Good. Couple of different substitutes.
Thank you. I want to see if the maker of the substitute motion would be open to an amendment, friendly, I hope. So what I'd like to suggest is that along the lines of facilitating some progress on this and also getting us to a transition plan, I'd like to suggest that we direct staff to do an RFQ or an RFP or whatever it would be to find a consultant that has financial and legal expertise to look at what the options for the transition, help us write a transition plan with options for if a CFD continues, which could be all the variations of the original motion, or other options, and then also to start looking at what would be the options if we don't have a CFD that goes forward. How are we going to work out these relationships between the jurisdictions? So I would like to suggest that as an amendment to the substitute motion. It's saying that instead of a facilitator, a facilitator consultant, that we look for a consultant with legal and financial expertise to help us, the board and the FORA staff, draft options for a transition plan. We're trying to get to a transition plan, but we don't know yet if we're transitioning to a world where we have a CFD or not. So the legal and financial consultant would work with the FORA board and staff for options for a transition if there's a CFD that continues, and then options for a transition plan if there's no CFD.
I view that as a refinement of my motion, and I'm happy to accept that.
Just so I can understand, the motion is to send out an RFP for a financial consultant to do an analysis with, on the different options presented to us today.
Yes, the options available to us if the CFD can be continued and transferred, or, well, continued, or if there's no CFD, so that as we're doing all this work, we're ready.
Okay, so the maker of the motion,
I accept that.
second. Do you accept?
Yes, I'm seconding that.
Okay.
So, but I just would like to clarify a couple of points. One, the first motion that was made, you semi-referenced that, but in the first motion, the Transition Task Force included in its recommendation continuation of tax increment. And so I believe the first motion includes tax increment. You spoke against the tax increment, and now you've made this motion, and I'm trying to hear if tax increment is included.
No, it has to do with the continuation of the CFD.
So tax increment would not be included. And to further clarify, when you spoke your motion, you were asking for a consultant with legal financial expertise to develop the transition plan with a CFD if it's being continued, and or what the transition plan would be if there was no CFD, correct?
Correct.
And the second, so my second stands. Now, I just want to go back to last week, whatever date we were here last, October 13th, that we did take a legislative position that already established that we should be looking for legislative action, directing staff to go seek legislative action from our representatives for funding, which of course, for the jurisdictions, if FORA would sunset, which that was, the caveat was the if. So we've already taken that position. The staff should already be looking at that, and any funding that would be the CFD or anything else the legislature wants to give us. So we've already done that, is my key point. So the motion covers what you want the.
You're telling me how much this board already agrees with my motion?
Yes, I am. I'm reminding everybody. We've
Okay.
done that. We all
So
want that.
we're having a dialogue now, so let's kind of get this back on track. We've got a motion and a second. Mr. Campbell and Mr. Hopkins.
Thank you, Chair Rubio.
And then I'm going to call the question.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to go back to some questions because I didn't get a chance to ask them earlier. That's quite a typo in this FORA memo, which, termination 2051, whichever is later, should actually apparently read earlier. The reason why I'm in disbelief over that typo is
Mr. Campbell, can you
thank you.
keep your comments to?
Yeah. So my
the
question
motion
is.
In question.
My question is, with the FORA ideally sunsetting after finishing 80% of their obligations, I think that was in state legislature, is it really to be read that the legislature and FORA itself for the last 20 years hasn't considered how the future obligations would be paid for when FORA sunsets, even if it was supposed to be sunsetted and after it was 80% completed? How did anyone, the state or FORA, envision those future obligations to be funded? So that's my first question.
Are you asking me to
Sure.
put my mind in the minds of the legislature?
Or FORA.
I don't know that that question is one that is capable of being answered specifically, but let me say generically that at the last meeting, which you weren't here, the executive officer said, you don't know what you don't know. And I think that's true in this case in answering your question. The legislature established the Fort Ord Reuse Authority. The initial term was a 20-year term. Everybody thought from the legislature down, even in the local communities, that the obligations, the capital improvement program, what was going to be necessary for economic recovery, the extreme economic recovery that was going to be necessary when Fort Ord closed here, would be accomplished within that 20-year time frame. And in fact, the legislature believed that so much that they established a generic Military Base Reuse Authority Act the very next year, same year or next year, that is the generic version of the FORA Act. It also has a life of 20 years. That was what you know, you don't know. They didn't know there would be an economic downturn. They didn't know what kind of risks, how difficult it would be for developers to come in, get commercial financing, the uncertainties that happen when you close down a military base. They didn't know at the front end of the project that Fort Ord would be designated to be a Superfund site. They didn't know many, many things. So some of the information that's occurred over time has happened in the Fort Ord Reuse Authority process. So I don't know if that totally addresses your question.
I think no would have sufficed, and no, it wasn't planned for.
It's not that it wasn't planned for. There were plans that were in place, but there are certain things that are outside of anybody's control that have affected the ability to be able to fully implement the plan.
Okay, thank you.
Excuse me, will we be able to participate in
Oh.
this conversation?
Please let the board go through what it's going to go through, and there will be public comment.
Just for clarification's sake, please, on slide 28, item B is for a tax share, health and safety code 33. Is that the tax?
Mr. Campbell, please. The question is, are we going to send out an RFP for a financial analyst?
I'm sorry, I never had my questions answered by the presenter.
Well, I'm
Okay.
sorry, I asked for questions.
And a motion was made before I had the chance to.
Well, I asked for
Okay.
questions when the presentation was done. So please, we're on the question. Okay, so,
Okay, so the question is whether we should have an outside objective
Right.
party take part in this. Yes, that's.
whether or not this board is going to put out an RFP for a financial and legal analyst.
That is part of the recommendation that we give direction to staff, and I absolutely say we give direction to staff to provide us with some objective, factual information on how best to proceed. Yes.
Thank you. Okay, at this time, I'll open public comment. How many people are going to speak?
Well,
Please
one
give
of
me a
them
raising of hands.
just left because they have children to take home and pick up and all of that. And, we're supposed to be a part of this conversation. We're not getting paid. And the disrespect
Neither am I.
that we're receiving from this body should not be happening. It should not be happening. The things that the community have been concerned about has not been addressed in the slides nor the conversations. Now, the Mellow Roos bill talked about low and very low income housing. That is not a priority here. We're 20 years down the road. Everything that is very important has been put on the back burner for our community, and there is no reason for that. It should not be happening. You're talking about affordable housing, livable wage jobs. It seems as though this board exists for those who sit here at this table and their partners and builders and whoever else, but not for the local community. Our children don't even have recreation or anything else around here. And this is pitiful. The health effects and impacts are not being addressed. Nothing is being addressed that the local community is concerned about. Now, everywhere else across this country, even in the state of California, where there's been catastrophes, people have come forth and been asked to come forth, donate, do this, get the people back on their feet. That has never happened here at Fort Ord. Hundreds of thousands of people lost jobs and everything else. Our community, the African American community, has been greatly gentrified. That has not been addressed. The rent has never been addressed. Raise the rent as high as you want. Drive the people out. We don't care. This is what we're supposed to be standing here for and listening to you for. Excuse me, but it's pitiful.
Thank you, Chairman and members of the FORA board. As was mentioned a couple times, Marina Coast did submit a letter, and I just wanted to speak to that real quick so the public knows what was actually in that letter. I know there's some heavy lifting going on tonight, but I think as we move forward, it's important that we're clear on what assets are to be transferred, and I think there's some clarification needed for some of the words that were in the staff report and FAQ that talks about the water, wastewater rights, and infrastructure. In there's a couple phrases that talks about that could be future assigned, or that the water rights are owned and then need to be passed on to the successor agency. Well, nearly 16 years ago, almost to the day, October 23rd, 2001, the Army deeded the water, wastewater rights infrastructure to FORA the very next day, although those were deeded to the Marina Coast Water District. So those are owned by the Water District. And so I think it's clear that as we move forward that we need to have that clarity. And I'm not sure if the Transition Task Force continues to look at the documents that have been filed online for that group. But I think it would be helpful if those deeds were actually loaded into there as well, because I noticed that they aren't there, and I think it would be very helpful for that group as they move forward in the transition process. So thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Nancy Amadeo. I'm a council member from the city of Marina. Number one, I would like to say thank you to the FOREST staff for the excellent presentation. I too am on brain information overload. But I also am concerned about the language in the memo, attachment B, that speaks to the termination of FORA and specifically to the CFD. And that hasn't been, I believe, addressed properly in either one of the motions, although I would say I support Mary Adams' motions with Jane's amendments. the problem is if you read this as staff has suggested that it should have been changed, termination or 2051, whichever is earlier. Earlier doesn't make grammatical sense at all. Why would you have FORA, which was supposed to terminate in 2020, and you have a caveat for 2051? The 2051 would be unnecessary if whichever is earlier. It only makes sense if it says whichever is later. So I think it's important, very important, that you find out whether or not you need legislation to continue the CFD. And that wasn't addressed. What was addressed is the CFD has to go forward, so let's make sure we have legislation to do that. That may not be necessary. This is where the legal consultant will be exceptionally important to ensure that you have proper information before you make a decision. I said it last time, you've got to have adequate information to make a decision. And again, I just feel like there's too many questions to make a good decision about what we should be doing over the next couple of years. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Jan Schreiner, and these comments are of a personal nature as being a resident of Marina rather than representing Marina Coast. But I would recommend that this meeting be extended or continued for the questions of both the board and the public. It was a very long presentation by the staff, and the motions began before the questions were even finished by the board or by the public. There is on slide 16 a note about water augmentation. It looks like both Marina Coast and an old term called the MRWPCA are listed. I don't understand the contract of the MRWPCA for water augmentation. In particular, now they're called Monterey One Water, right? So that's outdated information or perhaps just confusing. The Marina Coast Water District charges what's called capacity charges. Those are pulled for future water at the time of the building permits, and there is language to say the building permit timing is how much the capacity charge will be. There's not this idea of everything's entitled, so the capacity charge is locked in. It sounded like somebody was saying at 2008. No, the capacity charge is being reviewed in a rate study right now, and at the time those building permits are paid, the capacity charge will be charged appropriately at that time. There's a slide on 14. It mentions non-Fort Ord entities. I want to know how that compares in that terminology that staff use. What is a non-Fort Ord entity when it comes to slide 19? Slide 19 lists a number of people who don't appear to me to have what's called a dog in the fight because they're not paying in, they're not having projects. So isn't that a non-Fort Ord entity? I really want to support that motion that is before the board. I just don't feel like you have had enough time to deliberate successfully. So the motion that is kind of a combination at this point of Adams, Parker, and Morton, I want to support that. And I just want to mention the idea of this full build out. It sounds very militaristic, like that is the goal, but in a civilian world, you don't always know what the finite timeline is on full build out. And so if you're waiting for full build out to eliminate this organization, we may be waiting generations, in my opinion, because already the housing market has started to go into decline. It was in the Business Week today, looking back at 2017. Thank you.
Hello, my name is John Wizard. I'm a community member in the city of Seaside. I would like to thank Supervisor Adams for her motion, substitute motion. It appears as though it was unpopular with some of you, especially with the rush motion that cut off everybody else's questions. But I think it's the appropriate question to ask, the appropriate motion to have. I disagree with Councilmember Garfield's false sense of urgency that there's not time to do a proper study. Since day one, you've known when your sunset's going to happen. It's written in the legislation when you were going to sunset. Why have you not made a plan before today when suddenly it's too late to make a plan? I agree with the motion as it stands that we need to seek financial legal consultation to make sure that we need a CFD and we need new legislation in Sacramento to have a CFD. If that's not the case, Slide 10 very clearly lays out how we can transition with multiple agencies without a bureaucratic agency to intercept funds and redistribute as it sees fit. Thank you.
I'm Daniel Weinstein, Seaside, California. Today I'm representing Landwatch Monterey. I'm going to read from a condensed version of a letter that Landwatch sent to the board on, I think it was October 26th. Neither the FORA board nor the state legislature should consider an extension without a full and impartial analysis of alternatives as required by Assembly Bill number 1614, Chapter 743. However, unfortunately, in consideration of a transition plan, FORA staff faces inherent conflicts of interest. Extended or not, FORA staff will be economically impacted by the transition in terms of salaries, pensions, and other benefits. The incentive exists for staff to pursue an extension to the exclusion of fair consideration of other alternatives that might better serve the public interest. Evidence of conflict of interest on the part of FORA staff already exists, including, number one, no response to a letter sent by Landwatch on October 3rd evaluating 11 critical public policy issues regarding the FORA transition, though thank you to Mr. Holomard for acknowledging that letter. Number two, release of a publication entitled Realizing the Vision, 20 Years of Fort Ward Reuse Progress, with no mention of FORA's shortcomings. Number three, a recommendation in a January 27, 2016 memorandum, as well as task force publications for a 5-year extension prior to the development and consideration of a transition plan. Because of this conflict of interest, the FORA Board of Directors must retain an objective third-party consultant to develop transition options. At a minimum, such options must include the termination of FORA consistent with current state law, 2, identification of responsibilities that require no further action, and 3, the potential assignments of unfilled responsibilities to other jurisdictions and agencies. Thanks for your consideration.
Thank you. Seeing no more public.
Just me, I think. Can you hear me okay? All right. So I'm a little nervous, and I think I have this together. So on page 11, no, let's see, number 11 on the transition planning questions and answers, justification for continued tax increment. It seems that, so I was here on the 13th, and I asked about the single entity successor in the recommendation that gave power, continued power to collect tax increment revenue that FORA would have if it were to continue. I'm hoping that I have that in my mind. My head is so full from this afternoon's presentation, and thank you for that. But in your answer to my question about the property taxes, I'm not quite sure that I understand the answer, or that there is an answer. It says FORA's property tax revenue comes as a result of the state legislation that was specifically targeted to this military base reuse project. The commenter is right that any expenditure of these funds should be directed to projects that serve the public good. But so my question is, if FORA didn't sunset and the continuation of that special tax revenue were to continue, would those funds be targeted to our public schools with respect to our dependence on that type of tax dollars? Thank you. I hope that's clear. Yeah, all right.
I'm Sue Hawthorne. I'm a citizen of Seaside, and I'm a little confused about what the procedure here would be. We have a motion and a secondary motion, and unfortunately, the first motion came by so fast that I didn't even hear what was proposed. I hope the rest of you actually have it clear in your mind what it is you're about to be voting on. You probably do. But the gist of this for me as a citizen is that FORA has existed for a very long time, and it's hard to tell exactly what you all have accomplished And there's a truism in business, which is when you are a consultant, if you get a contract, you do your best to give a good solution. But if you are not able to come up with a good solution, then you just do your best to keep the relationship going as long as you can. Now, on slide 19, there's the entitled CFD fees for Marina, the county, Seaside, Delray Oaks, and on slide 20, the entitled projects. These are obligated developments that have not actually happened yet, which says to me that the model was inherently flawed, that you have to build on pristine land to get the money to remove the blight. That's obviously a model that hasn't worked as well as you thought it would, and rather than perpetuating that model or some facsimile of that model, I would like to see a new direction, a different model, something that will actually move this intended, the intended outcome and actually bring it closer to fruition. Thank you.
Hello, thank you, board and FORA staff. My name is Dawn Alba. I'm a resident of Marina, business owner in Marina, and a homeowner in Marina. I want to probably just echo all of what you heard with the public comment thus far, especially Landwatch's letter. But I also want, as I look around the table and the voting members, I'm not sure how many individuals actually drive through our property and all the blight, and how many actually reside and shop within our area. It seems like the voting is a little skewed when it comes to equal issues versus the voting power. I hope that moving forward, if there is another entity built or for a light, that particular voting power would be considered with the individual communities that are going to be responsible and have the most challenges to what is currently the blight. Thank you.
Ron Cheshire with the Monterey Santa Cruz Building and Construction Trades Council. FORA was supposed to sunset in 2014, but you took legislative action to move it forward. Now you're looking maybe to do the same thing, just like before. This isn't anything new. If you don't, you're subject to the legislation that's currently at hand, and you need to go through the LAFCO process. You need to submit a plan to them. Do you have time to implement the suggestions that were made? That's our concern. We like the original recommendation from staff because what's taken place out here at Fort Ord is we have winners and we have losers. The winners are those that have their entitlements and have their projects approved. The losers are going to be those that have one or two projects approved, like an RV resort or something, or don't have anything approved. And if FORA is not here, or a group of whatever you want to call it, a JPA, that doesn't have that brain trust sitting back over there, that has basically worked, has the historical knowledge, the expertise, and such to get things done, you're putting the communities that don't have the entitlements and such, don't have their projects approved, at an extreme disadvantage. So, having heard what I've heard today, I mean, we have you have a motion, and you have a substitute motion in order to look at this a little deeper. Our concern is, are you going to look at it so deep to where you go into the time to where you have to present something to LAFCO and it's too late? Thank you.
Hello,
Hello, my name is Myra Malaga, and I'm a citizen of the United States, plus I'm a resident of Marina since 1979. And I really thank Frank O'Connell as well as Gail Morton for being our council members, and you're doing a great job. Thank you. I really wanted to ask, out of curiosity, how many of you started 20-something odd years ago when FORA first started? May I ask, how many, by raise of hand, how many started from the beginning of FORA?
Please make your comments, please.
Oh, sorry. And so you know the reason why FORA was formed? Actually, we really don't need all the information that you're asking for, because a consultant once told me a consultant's job is to gather all the information from all of you, chew up the bubble gum, and spit it right back at you. And I know you have historical knowledge of all the bases that have closed in the United States. If you study all the bases that have closed and study what they have done with the land and what they have used with their lands, you'll realize that the answers are right there. I would like you to consider the children. Marina is a young city. The average age is 31, and just consider the children and sustainability of Monterey County. Thank you.
For our board, my name is Gary Curcio, and I'm the Government Affairs Chair for the Monterey County Hospitality Association. We have 25,000 employees in the county of Monterey and over 250 member businesses. Our big concern are our employees, many of whom live in the jurisdictions that are sitting around this table that are most involved in this FORA plan. And I think everyone wants a result that ends up the most productive and the best overall result for all the stakeholders involved. And on that basis, we would just urge that while the sausage continues to be made, that you look toward some model of a regional approach in the final solution. We really feel that that would be best, and certainly would maintain the best order and the best continuity, avoiding many possibly poor unintended consequences of going in another direction. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Sid Williams. I'm a resident of Marina. I'm here because I really strongly feel FORA is going to go away. Whether I like that or not is not the point. But the knowledge and the history that is, as one individual said, resides over there is pretty important. And so to turn FORA over to each individual jurisdiction would be, I think, a disaster. There needs to be a regional approach, because this is a regional issue. It always has been, and it will be until it's done after I'm dead. So if FORA has to go, then I think you have the obligation to present a plan that creates a replacement of some kind, Joint Powers Authority, whatever that may be. And obviously you have an obligation to figure out how to give that authority the means to fund what remains of the CIP. I think there's a lot of voices that are against FORA, particularly. That's their right to believe that. They may be right in some of their decisions and some of their thoughts. But there's also a large contingent of people that come and talk to you whose primary responsibility is to retard or defeat growth of the former Fort Ord. And your responsibility when you transfer away or extend, whichever way it finally comes out, is to continue the regional approach, pass on the knowledge that the jurisdictions won't have because they don't have them. And remember all three of the E's.
Lane Long, City Manager at the Marina, and I'll try to keep my comments brief. I just want to go back to the legislation that created FORA, Title 7.85, and it's great legislation. All these rules that we've been dealing with for 20 years are set forth in this legislation. As equal a part of that legislation is the last part, that's 67700, that says very specifically, this title shall be inoperative when the board determines that 80% of the territory of Fort Ord that is designated for development or reuse in that plan prepared pursuant is developed, or June 30th, 2020, whichever occurs first, and on January 21st, 2021, this title is repealed. So we're talking about this title that was created, and we've been living under it, but it's very specific part of that title. It says it wants it to terminate in 2020. And then part of that same part, so this is A, then B, the legislature told LAFCO, it said the Monterey County Local Agency Formation Commission shall provide for the orderly dissolution of the authority, including ensuring that all contracts, agreements, pledges, etc., are honored and properly administered, and that all assets of the authority are properly transferred. Again, the legislature told LAFCO, said, you shall do this. And then the next part, it goes on and says, the board shall approve and submit a transition plan to LAFCO before December 30th, 2018, so LAFCO can do its job. And then the last part they showed in the slide is the transition plan shall include this. So it was all laid out 20 years very clearly. I think it's very clearly in the legislation what we were supposed to do here. LAFCO can't do its job until FORA does its job. And the FORA staff has been doing a great job. They're struggling. It's very complex. But we need to get something to LAFCO so they can do the job that the legislature has mandated that they do. And one last comment I want to do on the entitlements. And everyone says, well, if you have an entitlement, you're at a huge advantage over those that don't have entitlements. Well, look at Cypress Knolls. That is entitled. That's the biggest blight that is you driving Imjin Road to Marina. So if it's entitled, that does not mean that you don't have problems. Let me give another example. The dunes, that is an entitled property. But for the dunes to be able to develop, Marina had to give up all of its property tax revenue for that development to move forward. And that means all that property tax revenue, a large part goes to the dunes partners, but a part goes to FORA, and Marina gets zero. And so if you're saying that these entitlements are benefiting Marina and no one else, that is not true. Marina had to give up everything in property tax for those entitlements to be able to move forward. The beautiful Veterans Hospital Clinic that was just created, $200,000 goes to FORA, zero to Marina in property tax.
Thank you.
So entitlements aren't the blessing we think they are.
Okay. So bringing it back to the board, I'm going to call the question on the...
Excuse me, if I may procedurally, Chair?
Yes.
I'm sorry, there's a motion and there's a substitute motion and...
An amended substitute motion.
Amended substitute motion. And at the time when Board Member Campbell was asking questions, the call for the question had not been made. He should have been allowed procedurally to complete his questions, since there was an amended substitute motion and a motion. He has a right to ask questions on either one of those. So I'd ask the chair to just reconsider for the purpose of allowing Board Member Campbell to finish questions.
Mr. Campbell will have his opportunity when we get done with this particular motion, the amended substitute motion, which was under the question at that time. His questions were on the presentation, which had happened earlier, and there was a motion, and there was questions on that. Then there was a substitute motion. We're going to call the question on the amended substitute motion, get that cleared out. And if there's need for the second motion, then we'll go ahead and do that.
When you say call for the question, are you calling for the question as to a vote on the motion? And if so, you have to and correct me if I'm wrong, Authority Council, you have to have a separate vote on the call for the question. to see
Correct.
whether or not- Okay, fine.
Okay, so on the call for the question, all those in favor? Aye.
I think we should do roll call.
Okay. Yeah.
On the call for the question, roll call vote.
No, we don't get to do that yet. On the call for the question. Roll call. Give her the mic.
If I or someone wanted to make a comment on the motion, if we vote to call the question, then all comments are, right? We just go directly to the vote.
Right.
Under the motion for call for a question, I wondered when would be the appropriate time for ex officios to make comment and ask questions, because I haven't been called on, although I have tried to.
Well, we're going to do the call for the question. The call for the question is always appropriate, and that's being determined right now.
Ready?
We're ready.
Director Parker? Director Phillips?
Yes.
Director Adams? Director Edelin? Director O'Connell?
No.
Director Morton? Director Hoffa? Director Rubio?
Yes.
Director Campbell? Director Carbone? Director Gunter?
Yes.
Director Garfield?
Yes.
Director Reimers?
Okay, that has been established. Now we go back to the original motion, which,
That was the call for the question.
okay, yeah, this is getting crazy. Good grief. Somebody have a program? Okay, now the amended substitute motion. Roll call vote, please.
A yes vote would say yes to get outside counsel. A no would be.
Right.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Director Parker? Yes. Director Phillips?
No.
Director Adams?
Yes.
Director Edelin? Director O'Connell? Director Morton?
Yes.
Director Hoffa?
No.
Director Rubio?
No.
Director Campbell? Director Carbone?
No.
Director Gunter?
No.
Director Garfield?
No.
Director Reimers?
Okay, so that fails as a substitute motion. Now, back to the original motion, which was the task force recommendation as presented in the staff report. Now, Mr. Campbell, you had some questions.
Thank you, Chair. The second question, or it became the third question, was on slide 28 for clarification. Line B, for a tax share, Health and Safety Code 33492.70. Is that the continuation of the property tax increment?
It's not 28.
Yes.
I'll find it somewhere.
I just, okay, thank you. I just want to be clear that that's being,
It's in the FORA tax share. It's actually in this section. It's right here. It's this slide. I believe, Councilmember, this is the correct slide you're talking about right here?
yes.
Okay, thank you.
So yes, just to be clear that because in one of the previous staff reports, it said that the issue was not really commented upon, and I just want to be, see if it's actually in this staff report. And then as my last question is, could you name any significant differences between the what is envisioned as FORA Light and the current FORA board? I mean significant differences. I'm a little unclear as to whether the difference between continuing FORA, asking for that extension, and what FORA Light is when it's all the same taxes and all the same powers, what are the significant differences between those two ideas? Thank you.
Chair, would you like me to take a stab
Yes,
at that?
please.
So with respect to the language on this slide, this fair and equitable language comes out of the implementation agreements. This is what every jurisdiction that has property on Fort Ord has agreed to by contract. Redevelopment Authority Council has already concurred that these agreements are contractual obligations for purposes of redevelopment law and pass-through of property taxes. So that's that one. With respect to the significant differences of FORA Light and a joint powers agency, a FORA Light, when we talked about FORA Light, that was here. When we talk about extending the FORA Act, the FORA Act currently has this board's composition. FORA Light refers to a different board composition or other things that would be a different scaled back, if you will, type of an agency. And if you amend the FORA Act or extend the FORA Act, some of the deficiencies, some of the issues that have been raised by board members and others, such as whether or not the requirement to have 2 votes should continue, whether or not all 13 members and all ex officios should continue to be represented on the board, or whether that should just be the underlying jurisdictions and CSUMB should be identified in the existing state legislation. That is what is sometimes referred to as FORA Light or FORA Shell if you want to have the 5 land use jurisdictions and only a mechanism to collect your CFD. That is sometimes referred to as a FORA Shell. The difference between that and the single entity successor is the single entity successor joint powers agency would be a separate legal entity. It does not have the FORA name. It would be formed by contract by the underlying jurisdictions or those jurisdictions that wish to participate in it by agreement, and that might be some or all of the parties here. The structure of that would still have to be detailed more specifically as part of a more specific transition plan. The rights and financing things, the other things that are inside the FORA Act would not necessarily apply in the joint powers agency scenario. It's a different legal entity. It's created under a different legislated authority of state law. It's Government Code Section 6500 and following is the statutory authority to create a joint powers agency. It could have a completely different staff. There are lots of differences that would be developed by contract when that agency is established. So it is not an exact FORA. Likewise, if you extended the FORA Act, contracts with the Fort Ord Reuse Authority that don't have termination dates or terminate upon FORA's sunset would continue. Under the JPA scenario, they would not continue. Any document that terminates upon FORA's termination would have to be either assigned or revised, or there would have to be a different action because it's a new legal entity that would have to be addressed. The JPA might have a different legislative oversight than an extension of FORA, in that it could be that this board decides as part of the transition plan that regional transportation is function transferred, whereas the JPA would focus only on on-site and off-site, or would focus only on certain things. The proposal currently that the Transition Task Force, which I might add does not include specifically property tax revenues in the motion itself, it just says it's a single entity. It seeks to extend the CFD and powers and to utilize the implementation agreement and voting percentages as the basis for the next step in the transition planning process. So the funding mechanisms, I think, are an open question. What staff has suggested to this board today and through different staff reports is that at a minimum, the Community Facilities District should be extended. There are only 2 ways to do that. One is to extend the FORA Act. One is to amend the Mello-Roos code. One of the earlier commenters talked about whether or not we even need special legislation to address the Mello-Roos issue. And I will tell you, as outlined in the presentation, there are two issues related to transferring your Mello-Roos. One has to do with the language inside the Mello-Roos formation documents that this board adopted. The second is a bigger prohibition that is found in state code. There is no state law authorization for transfer of a community facilities district that has been established by a military base reuse authority. So answering that question is a huge issue. Does that address your question?
Thank you. Yes, it was much more involved than I had imagined, and I think it brings up a lot of questions that this board, I think, will need to address in the near future. And I hope any direction to staff will include a schedule, unless staff is actually proposing one, to come back with the answers to a lot of these questions, or the possible solutions to a lot of these questions, such as slide 12 has a lot of wonderful questions on there, and I look forward to the staff returning with some answers. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Hale.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I'm going to ask my questions and give my comments while I have the opportunity to speak. So from a TAMC perspective, and I say that from a staff perspective because my board has not taken any position on these issues, I think the key issue of concern with JPA, should it continue essentially in the same manner that FORA is the on-site, the preference for on-site projects. Because if you take a look historically over the amount of money that has come to regional projects, it's about 1% of the fee. And yet right now, when you look at the outstanding obligation, it's about 30% of the total obligation. So with projects, most particularly the 156 project, looking to move forward in some fashion or another in the relatively near future, within the next, let's say, 6 years, I'm concerned that the funding needs for that project will not be met if the current 1% allocation comes towards regional projects. And the obligation shows in the neighborhood of $17.6 million that should be coming to that project alone, not to mention the Highway 1 Seaside Sand City and the Highway 1 Monterey Road interchange. I think there's a similar issue with regards to the off-site projects, again, several of them which are in the TAMC fee, but not quite as extensive. About 17% of the money has gone to off-site projects, and there's about 25% obligation remaining. So I would just ask that as you move forward in this process, we take a look at equalizing that out so that the regional approach that many speakers have said they appreciate about this body could actually take place in the transportation realm, because right now it's a fairly localized approach in terms of the on-site for issues. The questions that I would hope could be addressed as you move forward in this process is the whole notion on the entitled developments. Is very good to get that information today. Some of those entitlements are quite old, and I understand that at least in the city of Marina, they're looking at re-upping or revising or renewing those in a manner so that they wouldn't be entirely reliant on the CFD, or that there could be a language that said a CFD or other funding mechanism. I don't know whether Seaside or the county have the same issue, or whether in fact East Garrison is going to be built out by the time FORA or a JPA would take place anyway. So it may be moot in the county, but I do believe there may be a transition that could happen for at least the transportation projects. These entitled developments would be able to contribute to a funding mechanism without having the CFD having to carry forward. And then the last piece that I wasn't quite sure from all the good information we've gotten on the Mello-Roos was whether an amendment would just be legislative or whether it would require a vote. I had originally thought it would require a vote. Thank you.
Supervisor?
Yeah, you weren't speaking for TAMC completely, were you? Good, because I'm not sure we all agree with that. But I think it's really clear that, and I will support the motion because we need some entity to move forward, some regional entity. And I agree with my colleague, Ms. Garfield, that it should be as limited as we absolutely need to make it. But we need some regional approach, some JPA to guide us in the direction we're going. And if you say, well, FORA, it really isn't needed anymore and should have been discarded, then you look at Sherry Damon over there. We had to bring her in because we weren't doing prevailing wages and the individual entities weren't doing what they were supposed to, and we had to come in and step in. That was hearing from our colleague over there almost every week or every month, and we had to bring her in to do that. So that shows you some of the things that we need for the coordination. So I call for the motion.
Okay, there's several people that still had their hands up. Mr. Moore, Mr. Lewis, Mr. Hoppa. Oh, I'm sorry, Ms. Reimer. And then we'll entertain the motion to call the question and go through that process.
So just a quick question and a clarification with respect to the staff report. In the third paragraph, there is a sentence that reads, based upon existing contract terms, that water service and wastewater rights will be assigned to Marina Coast Water District. That will be would seem to be a typo. Just wondering if staff has seen the deeds from some time ago that actually deeded us those water and wastewater rights.
I mentioned that prior to your arrival, and we've also had from your general manager comment about that, and we also had legal review on that matter, and we concur in the question, and we'll take care of that. We're having a meeting Monday to fix it.
Excellent, thank you very much. And then just one other clarifying, kind of a clarifying comment. The last sentence of that paragraph reads, MCWD will need to add an assessment to the fee. Technically that's correct, but I just want to be clear that that quote-unquote assessment would be an increase in capacity charges to be paid by whoever is building on the former Fort Ord. So that is a cost if somehow, God forbid, FORA does not in the next couple of years come up with $17.8 million, we'll turn around and layer that on top of the existing capacity charges for folks who are doing development on the former Fort Ord. Thank you.
Ms. Reimer.
I just want to say that I agree with the fact that this does need to continue to be a community, a larger area oversight and cooperation. And one of the speakers said that we just shouldn't turn it over because it would be a disaster to turn it over to the municipalities. I will say, as a council member, I understand every person here who is involved in a council and lives in a community wanting to be in charge of their own land and their own jurisdiction, and I recognize that, and I'm very sympathetic to that. We have a different format here. We have land that has been designated and obligations, as I said earlier, that come with that designation and with the challenges, and I encourage everybody to work together to finish the jobs that have already been started. And I compliment FORA staff and FORA boards. I've just been here a short time. People say not much has happened, and I know we're looking at the blight, and that's why we're seeing things have not happened. We want that gone. But we have a university. I'm now saying we, and I've only been here a couple of years, not even a year. We have a university, we have a veterans cemetery, we have a veterans clinic, we have Marina's Dunes complex, which is lovely, brand new hotel. I can't say that East Garrison, Homes, I know more needs to be done, but I compliment everyone around this table, those who were here and have been here for years. A great deal has been accomplished. I'm suggesting that when we look at the layout for the future transition, that we not make it date certain, but make it project benchmark certain. And I think that might encourage everyone to step back and look at the big picture and hopefully work together to finish what's been started and a really fine beginning. So just had to say that I've said very little in my year and a half here. So.
Mr. Hoppa.
So as a member of both of the transition task force, I'd like the public to know how much time the Transition Task Force spent. The PowerPoint presentation you heard tonight, there was a lot of information packed into it. That information has all been presented to us and a great deal more. And so this is why I do feel comfortable moving forward in giving direction today. I'm also concerned about timing, that the legislative process could take more than a year. It's quite possible. And I don't believe we can wait a year while we continue to study in order to give legislative direction. Personally, I think the importance of a regional body is essential, that the impact is regional and we need to have a regional forum to work out our differences. There is benefit to having a second degree of consistency. There's also, I personally have concerns without a successor agency of who will enforce the base reuse plan, who will ensure, as Ms. Stone said, about affordable housing, that the jurisdictions actually fulfill their obligations to build affordable housing, who will ensure that the workers are paid what they're owed, who will ensure that we have the proper jobs housing balance. I think without a successor JPA, we could be in for a very confusing legal landscape. We also could be in for serious financial shortfalls. And so for all of these reasons, I support moving forward with the recommendation. I do think that there is merit in the executive committee considering and bringing back at a later date some considerations of a consultant to help us prepare for December 2018. I think they should consider the scope of a range of scope of duties and a sense of what the budget would be. I think that if we're going to go forward with a consultant, that we want to make sure we do that thoughtfully. I'm not opposed to that. Had that been part of the original motion, I would have supported it, and that was what my alternate would have been.
Okay, now there's been a question called. On the calling of the question, all those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Okay, now we go to the original motion. Oh, sure.
I'm going to ask this for the third time because I've heard different answers. Ms. Damon said tax increment was not contemplated. The Transition Task Force recommendation contemplated tax increment. That was verified at the board meeting in September, verified with our executive director in a conversation. So now I don't understand, because I've heard different answers, is support of this motion for support of tax increment going forward.
I think that's to be defined as we move along. Right now, the question has been called and approved by the board. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Roll call, please.
Director Phillips? Director Adams? Director Edelin?
Aye.
Director O'Connell?
No.
Director Morton? No. Director Hoffa? Director Rubio?
Yes.
Director Campbell? Director Carbone? Director Gunter?
Yes.
Director Garfield? Director Reimers?
Okay, it's approved, but we do not have unanimous, so it'll come back at a later date. Public comment is now open on anything not on the agenda. Seeing none, are there any board member comments?
Next meeting.
Seeing none, we stand adjourned.